Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from anthonymorganti.com and my new website, onlinephotographytraining.com. I'd appreciate it if, when you have time, you'd stop by that new website. I'll have a link for it in the description below this video. And in this video, I'm going to offer to you my top 3 tips for processing wildlife photos, or in the case of this image, a zoo photo. It doesn't really matter as long as your subject has feathers or fur. These tips should help you. Now, this video is kind of a teaser for my upcoming video series, Mastering Lightroom Classic CC, which I actually wanted to start earlier in the week, but I've been traveling so much, I found it difficult to get it started. But I'm getting back from New York over the weekend, and I'm determined to start that series next week. So look for it soon. Now, as far as this specific photo, all I've done to it so far is lens corrections, and I moved 4 sliders in the basic panel. I didn't even do any detail adjustments, so no sharpening, no noise reduction. All I did was move highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. There's a before, and there's an after. Now, the next adjustments usually are to remove some flaws in the image and then to spice up the image. And you could do that globally. You could add clarity and sharpness to add, make it look sharper. You could add some vibrance or saturation, make it look more colorful. Then you could, of course, reduce noise and add sharpening with the detail panel, but that does it everywhere. I prefer with even portraits of people, and especially with portraits of animals, is to do this in a more selective way. I like to pick out parts of the image that I don't really want my viewer to notice and adjust those specific parts one way, and then pick out the parts of the image I want my viewer to actually notice and adjust those another way. And the way I could do that is, well, there's several ways I could do that. The first thing I'd like to do as far as this image is concerned is to do something with the background. It's a little bit too noticeable. Now, what a lot of people do is, even if they're doing this on a more specific basis like I'm planning to do, is they would add, let's say, contrast to the subject. That means the rest of the image doesn't have as much contrast and it's not as noticeable. I prefer to do it the other way around. I like to take contrast away from where I don't want people to look. Now, I could do that with a brush. I could get a brush and do it, and in most cases that'll work fine. And in this case it probably would work okay. But because our gorilla is so dark, she has dark fur and dark skin, and she has some gray fur, so her tonal range is very specific. She has a lot of very dark tones and a little bit of very light tones, but no midtones really. Whereas everything around her is midtones. So my first tip is to use the tone curve to adjust contrast, whether you're going to be adjusting contrast up or contrast down. Now in this case, I'm going to adjust contrast down just on the midtones. And it's not as hard to do as you might think. Now again, you could come in here with the global contrast slider and move it down, but that does it everywhere, and that's defeating the purpose. So we're going to go to the tone curve, and there's 2 different tone curves in Lightroom. This is called the point curve. If you click this little box in the lower right hand corner, you'll get some sliders, and that's called the parametric curve. A lot of people call that the region curve. This is not the curve we want, so make sure you're using the point curve. And what we want to do is we want to put some points on the curve that will protect the tones we want to protect. I don't want to affect the darkest tones, her skin and a lot of her fur, and I don't want to affect the lightest tones, which is her gray fur. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put, first of all, a point right in the middle of the curve. Then I'm going to go down where the shadows are down here, and if you could see behind the curve, there's this grid pattern, and there's some darker grid lines that divide it up into a 4x4. And what we want to do is go to this point of intersection of those lines and put a point there, and then go up here in the top right hand side where the highlights are and put a point up in that area there. So we're protecting the highlights. Everything above this point is a highlight. We're protecting the shadows. Everything below this point is a shadow. everything between those 2 points are midtones. So I could come in here now and move this curve in a very specific way, which will reduce contrast in the midtones. Now, those of you that are familiar with the tone curve know that you could add contrast to an image by putting an S curve into the curve. And to do that, you would pull down on the left-hand side of the curve and push up on the right-hand side of the curve. Well, we want to do the opposite of that. We want to remove contrast. So on the left-hand part of the curve, between these 2 points, so it only will affect the midtones, I'm going to push up there. Then over here, between these 2 points, so it only affects the brighter midtones, I'm going to click and pull down. Now, you don't want to do this like a lot because the adjustment is actually very subtle. So if I go too far, you'll start to posterize the image. So you're flattening out the tone curve, and that tends to posterize the image. So it's, again, a very, very subtle adjustment. So we're just going to pull that one down there. And I'm going to give you a before and after. There's before, and just look at the background. And there's after. Now look at Sydney's face. There's before, and there's after. Now look at the background again. There's before and there's after. So you could see it affected the background in a more major way than it actually did our gorilla, because we protected the tones that concern her, the darkest tones and the brightest tones. So that's one way to do it. Now, in many instances, your animal is going to be more mid-tone. So you're probably going to have to use a brush. But I wanted to show you the little trick with the tone curve because I think it's underutilized and it works best in this instance. I think it looks more natural. You tend to see the brush a little more readily than the tone curve. So that was tip number 1. Now, number 2, keeping with the same theme where we're not really adjusting everything. We're adjusting specific parts of the image. I want to do local adjustments to enhance tonal qualities of specific parts of the gorilla, specifically her eyes, and she's got really deep brow, so it's dark in there. I want to brighten this area up. Secondly, I want to reduce noise. It was shot at ISO 6400, and if I zoom in, you can see there's quite a bit of noise. And thirdly is I want to sharpen it up a little bit. So again, I could come in here and reduce noise everywhere, but I really don't have to. I don't care if the background has noise. As a matter of fact, if the background has noise, that's good. It will tend to push the viewer's gaze to the sharper, less noise part of the image. So I don't care if the background has noise. I don't even care, actually, if the parts that are out of focus have noise, meaning her hand, the grass over here that she's holding, her hay. I don't care if that has noise. I just want to get rid of the noise over her face mainly, because that's, to me, the most important part where I want people to look. So I do noise reduction first as far as these local adjustments are concerned, and they're going to be local brush adjustments. So we're going to open up the brush, and I'm going to reset the sliders by double-clicking on the word effect. And then we're going to go down to the noise slider, and I'm just going to move it in. Now here's a little side tip. If you have a brush tool open or any of the tools open and you need to zoom in, typically you would have to close down the tool to zoom in, or go over on the left-hand panel, which I currently have closed, and go up to the top to zoom in. If you want to zoom in very easily with a tool open, hold the space bar in, and then you'll see your cursor turns into a little magnifying glass. Click with the left mouse button, and you could zoom in. You could also drag the image around. Hold the space bar in, then just drag the image around, just like that. So we could see there's significant noise around her eyes. Not that bad, though. I actually shot at ISO 6400 with a Nikon D500, but enough where I want to get rid of it. So I'm just going to get a brush that's big enough, and I'm just going to come in here and brush away the noise, mainly around her eyes, it looks like. It doesn't look like there's much noise anywhere else, just that very dark area around her eyes. Mainly, I want people to gaze at her eyes and face that are in focus. And that's the areas I'm concerned with noise. So I'm going to hold the space bar in and drag down, because this is all in focus. We have a lot of noise around her nostril here. So I'll get rid of that. And then I'll zoom back out. I'll hold the space bar and then click again to zoom back out. And I could then adjust the noise slider to fine tune it to the image. So that's a local adjustment to remove noise. We're still on tip 2, by the way. Now I want to brighten up that area around underneath her eyebrows and her eyes specifically. So I'm going to get a new brush, double click on the word new. We're going to double click on the word effect to reset the sliders. We're going to come in here and we're going to turn exposure up, and we'll turn it up quite a bit. We're going to readjust it when we're done. We're going to get a brush that will do the job. Also, on all my brush adjustments for this video, I'll have feathering all the way up, flow all the way up, density all the way up, and auto mask is turned off. So I'm just going to come in here and brush in some exposure under her eyes, around her eyes. Now, of course, this is too bright, but we're just doing it so we can see where we're brushing. Then I'll come in here and I'll readjust the slider so it looks more natural. And there's before and there's after. It's even a little too bright, so we'll bring it down a little bit. She looks like she was tanning. She had tanning goggles on. So there's before and there's after. That's better. So I like that so far. Even that might be just a touch too bright. Let's bring it down just a little bit, about 1/3 of a stop. So that looks nice. Now, in some animals, you won't have to brighten all the way around their eyes. Gorillas have a deep brow, so it's very dark in there, so you need to brighten it up. On some animals, you will, and some animals you won't. And in all animals, you may want to brighten up their iris. Even if you brightened up their eye like I did on Sydney, you may want to brighten up her iris too and add some clarity and sharpness and vibrance to their iris. A lot of animals have gorgeous irises, and you'd want to do something to make sure they're noticed. And again, you're just going to do subtle adjustments. You're not going to make them radioactive bright or anything like that. Now, in the case of gorillas, they kind of have drab irises. And in the case of Sydney, it's really not necessary. But for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to show you how I would work on an iris on an animal. So I'm going to double click on new to reset the sliders, and I'm going to get a new brush, and double click on the word effect to reset the sliders. And for eye adjustments, you could go to the drop down, and there is a specific iris enhance adjustment, and it works on animals as well. You may want to zoom in, just push in the space bar, click to zoom in. And we're going to go over the iris, and you could just go over their irises like this. Now, in case, as I mentioned, the gorillas aren't, they don't have these irises I'm talking about like most humans have and a lot of animals have. We'll zoom back out, hold the space bar in and zoom back out. And then you could come in mainly and adjust the exposure slider to get it to look more natural. You may want to add some sharpness to it as well. Exposure down a little more. So here's our brush adjustments so far, before, after. It's really subtle. I mean, it doesn't look like a lot so far. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to sharpen very specific parts of the image. In this case, her eyes, her cheek over here, her nose, and her chin. So we're going to get a new brush, double click on the word new, and then we're going to double click on effect to reset the sliders. We'll turn sharpness up quite a bit. And then I don't want to zoom in for this. I just could brush over here, her eyes, cheek, everywhere that's in focus basically, which isn't a lot, technically, if you look at the image. And let's see where it was that one. Sorry. I'm hovering over the button and I could see where I painted. You also could click this little checkbox over here and it will give you a red overlay and you could see where you painted, and then it could maybe better help you paint exactly where you want it. That. And if you make a mistake like I did up here, hold the Alt or Option key in. It's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac, and the brush will turn into a little minus brush and you could erase whatever. Or you could click over here on the erase button over here and then erase whatever the setting is. I got flow down on that. There we go. So you could go back to our regular brush and turn off our overlay by clicking this little button there. And that looks pretty good. You could add some clarity here if you like. So I'll move clarity to the right. So again, just subtle adjustments. There's before and there's after. So far, so good. These are the local adjustments that I like to do. Of course, your image will be different. You could adjust it how you like with different local adjustments. I encourage you to experiment. Now, tip number 3. If you're photographing wildlife and it's overcast out, or if you're photographing images in a zoo or wildlife in a zoo, and they're inside of an enclosure, the light tends to be boring and drab. And images seem to come to life if you just warm them up a little bit. Now, we could go to the basic panel and I could just change the white balance, but that warms up all the tones. What looks better, in my opinion, is if just the highlights get warmed up a little bit. And it's very easy to do that with split toning. So we're going to go to split toning, and I'm going to take the hue slider of the highlights part, and I'm going to move it towards yellow. Then I'll take saturation and I'll move that up. And you can see that how that's mainly affecting just the highlights. And then we just want to do it a little. It's very, again, subtle adjustments. There's before and there's after. We get that more yellow. And just a little bit. And it just adds a little bit more life to the image, in my opinion. And it doesn't affect, of course, the shadows. And I think it looks better than if you do a white balance adjustment. Now, there is the 3 tips. And you'll notice it's very subtle, because typically with wildlife photography, you want the animal to look like it's supposed to look like. You don't want to really do heavy modifications and heavy processing just to bring out like a certain color of the feathers or certain part of the, skin or whatever of the animal. You want it to be natural. What you're mainly doing your processing for is to control the gaze of the human that is looking at the picture. If you subtly remove contrast from the area around your subject and you sharpen and brighten and remove noise from the part of the image you want your subject to look at, that is a win-win right there. So that's what the whole goal of, at least my goals, are when I process a wildlife image. So there's before and there's after. There's before and there's after. So you could see how I minimize the areas around Sydney and I maximize the parts of Sydney that I want you to look at. So that's it for this video. Thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. Look for that new video series, Mastering Lightroom Classic CC, sometime next week. I'll talk to you guys soon.